Hello everyone, my name is Mathis Richter. I'm a postdoc at the Institute for Neural Computation at the Ruhr University in Bochum in Germany. I'm going to talk today about grounding in dynamic field theory. Let's dive right in with an example. So imagine you're in a scene like this with a whole bunch of elephants around and you're there with a friend, and that friend says, "Look, there's a baby elephant that's walking toward its mother." And you hear those words, you look around in the scene, and then at some point you find the elephant that she's talking about. And it's this process of mapping language that you're hearing onto an object or something in your surrounding that we call perceptual grounding. So it establishes a connection there. And it establishes it in a certain direction from language to perception. The other direction from perception to language is what happened when your friend generated or said those words, generated language. We call it description generation or describing. Now, grounding has been a field of research for a long time, and the term grounding is used somewhat differently. So let me clarify that for a second. So you may be familiar with the grounding problem, which arose in reaction to classical cognitive architectures, for instance, ACT-R or SOAR, because they had completely symbolic representations. So here's a depiction of that. There's the circle is one of these cognitive architectures, and the representations here of different concepts like baby or elephant are symbolic in the sense that these are just unique tokens. They actually used literal strings in these systems that then stand for what an elephant is. And these systems were criticized because they were missing grounding, and that means they were missing the meaning of what an elephant is. So, the meaning would be some kind of connection to what does an elephant look like, how does it move, how large is it, and so on. So it's missing a connection to sensory motor representations. For some people, grounding is then in establishing that connection, in the sense that when you don't know what an elephant is and you see one for the first time, you build up some sensory motor representation of it, and then you establish that connection by learning synaptic weights between that representation and a representation for the word elephant, for instance. So the grounding is really in learning that connection. For us, that is not something that we model, but we begin where that connection has already been established, and we're more interested in how the different representations that there are for instance, a word or for a representation of an elephant, how these are activated, in what order, what are the mechanisms, and what is the neural substrate that is necessary to establish the connection on top of the connections already being there. Now, the model that I'm going to show you today unfortunately doesn't work with perceptual input like this, but we use these kinds of simplified scenes. So these are video streams of these colored balls on a white background. Short video clips. Sometimes the scene's stationary, like this one. Sometimes some of these balls are moving. And then there are two types of tasks. The first task is, let's look at that here, is perceptual grounding tasks, where you get that video input. So the model gets the video input, and it also receives language input, like here, where you get a simple relational phrase like the red object to the left of the green object. And then the task of the model is to map that language onto the correct object in the scene. So here it would have to put this red object into the attentional foreground because this object is to the left of a green object. This object actually is not. These perceptual grounding tasks have an added or a sub-problem in them, which we refer to as hypothesis testing. So you can maybe imagine that as a human being, if you hear the sentence and I start saying the red object, you may already look at the scene and pick out red objects and maybe think, oh, maybe he's talking about this thing. And then as I say more, as I say to the left of the green object, you then revise that hypothesis and you reject it and say, oh, that can't be right. You must talk about this object. And this is also something that happens in the model, and the model has to solve the problem of establishing hypotheses and then checking or rejecting whether they're true or not. The other type of tasks, and I'll show you a different example of this, is description generation, where you just see a scene and then the model has to generate language about it. So for instance, here you saw that this was a dynamic scene, and the model could generate something like the red object moving toward the green object as description of the scene. Now in description generation, there's a different subproblem which has to do with framing, because there are a lot of different ways you could describe the scene, and that depends on, first of all, the saliency of the objects, but it also has to do with the context of the conversation and the intent of the speaker in saying those words. How would you frame that situation that you're looking at? We don't really model a lot of this here. The only thing that has to do with framing is really in the saliency of the different objects, and that has an effect on what kind of language is generated. You also saw here that the model deals with spatial relations in these kinds of scenes. So relations like to the left of, to the right of, these are static relations, but also movement relations like this, which are toward and away. Right, and the object descriptions are simple colors: red, green, blue, yellow, this kind of thing. Okay, this is the model, or an overview of it. You're not supposed to understand this. What you can take away from it, though, is that first of all, it's complex. I'll break it down and explain it. But you can see that it consists only of DFT elements. There are one-dimensional fields here, two-dimensional fields, 3D fields. These circles are dynamic neural nodes, and all the arrows are synaptic connections between these elements. So there's only a single point where there are algorithms in there at the very perceptual front end. I'll point that out. The rest is just a single dynamical system with just a lot of variables that are coupled together. And the way I talk about it, it may seem like there are different modules, but that's really my way of trying to communicate different functions of the model. In a mathematical sense, it's really just one dynamical system. And maybe keep that in mind. Okay, so the perceptual input, I already told you that it's these video clips. Here in this example, we have a red, green, and blue object on this white background. And then the only algorithmic bit comes in right here, where we have an algorithm that extracts from every frame of the video an activation distribution that is then input into this dynamic neural field here, and everything else in the model is neural. So the field that I was talking about is a three-dimensional field. It's defined over camera space, X and Y, and the third dimension is the color dimension, or hue dimension. And the activation distribution that is generated by this algorithmic front end generates activation based on the color saturation of every pixel in the image. So the white background here doesn't have a lot of saturation, so the activation values are low. and the saturation at the image location, at the locations of these objects is high, so the activation is high. And then you can see that the colors of the objects determine where along this axis, along the color axis, the peaks of these objects stand. So the green object is here where their green colors are, and blue objects are down here in this slice. So whenever there's a colored object in the scene, you would have a peak in this field. There's another field like this, which also receives this activation distribution, which is defined also over X and Y space of the camera, but the third dimension is not color, but movement direction. It works a similar way. So if you have an object that's moving in the scene, for instance, this red object is actually moving toward the green one, then the movement direction of that red object is represented here with a peak at the particular position of the movement direction. You can see it's moving to the top left here, so the peak stands here. If an object is not moving at all, like the blue and the green object, you don't have a peak in this field. There's a layer in between here, which is a neural model of movement detection. It's based on transient detectors, which are set up at every pixel position. I'm not going to go into detail here, but just to mention that this is a neural mechanism. Good, so this is the perceptual input. The other input of the language comes in through activation of neural nodes. So for concepts of color and for other concepts that I'll point out, we have neural nodes that activate, that represent different colors. So we have a neural node for red, for yellow, for green, for blue. And when they're active, this means for us that they are part of the phrase input. And they're neural nodes, so they can be active or not active. And their perceptual meaning is encoded in synaptic connections from every node to a color field. The color field is a one-dimensional neural field that is defined of the color dimension. And the synaptic connections are such that, for instance, the yellow color here has connections which are centered around, I think, around here where yellow colors are, and generate a peak whenever that node is activated. For blue, the connections are such that they're at a different position. And this color dimension is the same dimension that we had in the perceptual field beforehand. So blue is activated, peak comes up here, and red and green are at different positions here. And then we have the same thing for movement direction. So you have things like leftward and upward and downward and rightward, and they map onto the movement direction field, which is also one-dimensional. And then there are also categorical concepts of relations. So we have relations of to the left, up, right, above, below, toward, and away. And these are also dynamic neural nodes, which can be activated or not activated. And the synaptic connections here are shaped in a way that they connect to a two-dimensional relational field. Let me play that again. So to the left of, for instance, is connected such that it highlights a shape of from the center leftward, as you can see here. This is the perceptual meaning of to the left of. So anything from the center to the left. Toward looks a little different. It's from the center downward. So that you could imagine if something is moving toward the center, it would be somewhere here. Okay. Now, for colors and for movement directions, these can actually appear in different roles. So if you have a sentence like this, the red object to the left of the green object, you can see that the colors appear at two different places. The first place here, the red object, is what we refer to as the target object. It's the object that you're actually talking about, the subject of the sentence. while the green object here is the reference object, which is an object that we're not looking for directly, but it's something that we use as a reference point. And because the colors can appear in these different roles, that also has to be represented. And you can see that here that the color nodes here for green and for red, there's more which aren't shown. They appear in both the target and the reference position. So there are copies of these concepts. We only have target and reference. We believe there could be a handful of these roles, but not many more. So otherwise, you would get way too many of these nodes. This concept of roles of target and reference also appears down here. I'll point that out later for coordinate transformations, where we have a reference field and a target field, which are spatial representations of these objects. Good. So the next thing that we want to talk about is the attentional selection part of the model. And this is a mechanism that allows the model to highlight objects of certain features. So this here is the color field the one-dimensional color field that we looked at before, which gets input from these categorical concept nodes. So if you imagine that we activate green here, that would generate a peak in this field, as we've seen before. And this coupled into a three-dimensional field like this, which receives activation from perception, if the perception had similar fields to this. This field, without any input from the 1D field, doesn't create any peaks, but only subthreshold bumps of these representations of objects. But with input from these one-dimensional fields, that input actually then becomes like a whole sheet of activation, which then may overlap with the bumps of input here and highlight objects, in this case, that are green. And this, the activation from this 3D field is projected down onto the two-dimensional space, and you can see that reads out the position, the spatial position of the green object here. The same mechanism you can do with the movement direction field here, and highlight objects, for instance, that are moving leftward. Here's a video of what that looks like. This is the one-dimensional field, which will get input from green and blue in a second. This is the perceptual input. This is the three-dimensional field. And now we can see this is input at green, highlights certain layers here for green. This is like a sheet of green, and this highlights the spatial position of the green object here. And then we do the same thing with blue. So these little squares here are slices through the three-dimensional cube of activation. So blue activates these few slices here, and this picks out then the spatial position of the blue object here. So this is a mechanism of attentional selection, of visual search, where you can visually search for objects with certain features. And you can then maybe imagine if you have a representation like this, where you have the spatial position of an object, you could then overlay this with a spatial position, as a representation like this of a relation, and figure out whether that object is to the left of, for instance, the center. And this is part of the solution, but we also want to be able to say this is to the left of not only of the center, but at every position in the visual array. And to be able to do that, we somehow have to be able to apply that spatial relational template to every position. We do this with a coordinate transform that Gregor, I think, has mentioned before. What that does is not shift around these spatial templates, but shift around the relative positions of objects. So if you have a scene like this with a red and a green object, and you say something like the red object to the left of green, you want the spatial template to be centered on the green object. Spatial template actually stays the same, but we change the representation of the target object here, the red object, so that it is centered in a space centered onto the reference object, which which would then be at this the center here. So the relative position of the target object with respect to the reference object would lie somewhere here as it comes up. You see, this then overlaps with the spatial template to the left of and gives you a signal, yes, this object is to the left of the green object. There's also another field here which gives you a different signal. So this has the inverse template of not to the left. And if the red object were on the other side, for instance, it would match here with this field. So this mechanism of a match field and a mismatch field gives you a signal whether this hypothesis that you've put up is true or it's not. Good. So now we've talked, the coordinate transforms are down here. This is a bit more complicated because it also does rotation. The last bit of the architecture is up here in control of cognitive operations. And this part of the architecture controls which part of the whole architecture are active, where do the flows of activation go, and allows it to generate different behaviors depending on what task it has to do. This is all structured by these small neural networks. So for every behavior, we have a network like this, and it consists of mainly two parts. The intention part, which activates a behavior. So this could, for instance, boost a field into being able to form peaks. The other part is the condition of satisfaction, or COS, which is a mechanism that signals that this behavior is finished. So when, for instance, if that field then creates a peak, that will be a signal that the behavior is finished. There are two other nodes here, the prior intention and condition of satisfaction memory node. And these are to be able to stack these small neural networks into more complex structures like hierarchies. So that you have on a higher level a structure like this, which activates a lot of different behaviors. And the model actually, I think, has 21 of these small networks, which are stacked in a hierarchy of 4 levels, because it orchestrates quite a lot of these behaviors. There's also a mechanism to be able to generate sequences of these behaviors, and I'll not go into detail here because I'm kind of running out of time. Good. So let's look at an example. This is a grounding task where I'm saying look for the red object to the left of the green object, and the activation of the sentence is, you can see that here in these nodes, red to the left of green. This is the perceptual input, and the architecture first looks for something red and finds this object here, puts it into the target field, and then looks for something green and finds this object. And you may notice that this object is not to the left of the green object, it's to the right. And you'll see here that the spatial position doesn't overlap with the spatial template to the left of, but overlaps with the inverse template. And this, in a second, will give this give a signal that this is incorrect and that this cannot be the right object. Now the architecture has memorized that it has tried this object and will then start the sequence again with another red object, the right one, so the correct one in this case. Then again look for something green, put that into the reference field here, and then extract the relative position of red to green, which then overlaps with this template to the left of. And this is then the signal that this is the correct object. And you now have a grounding of this phrase in perceptual representations here that fit the scene. Another example is here. This is an example of description. So I just say describe this, and there's a scene here where the red object is moving toward the green. You can see that these nodes are all off, but the model has to activate the right thing. So it's looking for a red object, and it says, oh, this is this is a red object. Puts that here into the target field, and then takes all the other remaining objects and sees whether these overlap somehow with these movement templates. It's activating the movement templates because the red object is moving. And one of these objects is overlapping best with one of the templates, and that's actually the green object, and it then extracts that it is green, and it also extracts that the relation fitting that is the two-word relation. And now you have the grounding, or the description process is now finished, where you have all the grounding here in these fields, and you've generated, or the model has generated, a description in these nodes where it says there's a red object moving toward a green object, and the red object is also moving upward because it's sort of moving in that direction. Good. So this is a very brief overview of the model, and this is all I wanted to talk about. So I'll leave it now here for questions. Thank you.